So in our last learning objective, we learned about what domain is. All right, remember, domain is just the x values you plug in. And now we're going to combine that learning objective with the main focus of this unit, which is rationals. And remember, rational is just ratio. It means there's division. So rational is just a function where there's a fraction involved. So we're going to find the domain of these rationals. Okay. So for most functions we've discussed, everyone we discussed in the first semester, you can plug in any number. You can plug in any number into a quadratic, any number into a line. And that means the domain of these is all real numbers, right? I can just plug in anything I want to plug in. Right, but rational functions are ones where we can't just plug in whatever we want. There's some times where there's values we cannot plug in. And what are those values that we cannot plug in? The important thing we have to remember is that we can't divide by 0. All right, so dividing by 0 is something that doesn't make sense based on the definition of division. All right, so we cannot divide by 0. All right, and this is going to come up in a lot of different contexts, but for us right now, just trying to figure out what the domain of rational is. That's the most important thing, remembering that I cannot divide by 0. All right, so let's look at the domain of this function. All right, so rational, again, rational just means there's this division bar here. All right, so that's what makes it a rational function. All right, but what is the domain? All right, domain is the x values I wanted to plug in. For instance, I could plug in 1. So I plug in 1, I get 3 times 1. 3 plus 1 over 5 minus 2, and that's 4 over 3. All right, so I can plug in 1. 1 would be in the domain. All right, but when we're dealing with rationals, sometimes there's things I can't plug in, and that has to do with the denominator, the bottom of the fraction being 0. Right, whatever I'm dividing by, I know this cannot be 0. All right, so whatever's on the bottom of the fraction can't be 0. So let's figure out what that would be. So what I'm going to do is take that bottom of the fraction, and setting it not equal to 0 is really the same as setting equal to 0. All right, so I'm going to solve this equation. All right, the bottom of the fraction is equal to 0. I add 2 to both sides. And divide both sides by 5. X equals 2 over 5. So if I try to plug 2 over 5 into this function, I'd get something on the top but 0 on the bottom, and I know I cannot divide by 0. All right, so this is my bad value, but everything else is fine. I can divide by 1, I can divide by 100, I can divide by negative 1,000. All right, every other number is fine to divide by. Just when the bottom is 0, that's bad. So when I go to say my domain, all right, you could write it out in words, all real numbers, because I can plug in anything except x cannot be 2 over 5. So everything else works, but 2 over 5 is the one bad number. All right, so that's the kind of easiest way to do it. So you can plug in anything except x can't be 2 over 5. All right, the way you can do this and kind of using math notation is we talked about this before, domain's a set, so you use these curly brackets. The symbol for all real numbers is this weird, it's like an R, but you put 2 lines on the left-hand side, so that's the all real numbers, and you put comma, x can't be 2 over 5. All right, so this is kind of the math notation, the shorthand way of writing it's all real numbers, but x can't be 2 over 5. All right, so that's how you can write it in shorthand. If you don't want to do that, you can just write it out in words. It's everything but that one bad value. All right, and this isn't going to change no matter what the rational looks like. Whenever you're dealing with a rational function, and again, one more time, rational just means it's a fraction. All right, there's a fraction in your expression. The domain, the only thing that's not going to be in the domain, the only thing you can't plug in is when the bottom of your fraction equals 0. So I'm always just going to take the bottom of my fraction and set that equal to 0. This is going to give me all the bad values. All right, if you look at this one, now we're mainly just trying to solve this equation. This equation has that x squared. So remember, whenever you have an x squared, we focus on this for 2 units. It's a quadratic, so we solve it a little bit differently. You can factor it. You can do completing the square. You can do the quadratic formula. There's a bunch of options for how you solve these ones. This one you can factor. You're looking for 2 numbers that multiply to give 15 and add to give 8. That's going to be 3 and 5. And again, because there's this 1 in front of the x squared, I can go directly to the factored form. And then it's factored, so now I can break those factors up into both of those are equal to 0. And this is all stuff we've done in previous units. And then I subtract 3, and I subtract 5. All right, so those, again, are the bad values. Those are the values I cannot plug into my rational because that would make me try to divide by 0. And 0 is the one thing you can't divide by. So now I can say my domain is all real numbers except x cannot be -3 and x cannot be -5. All right, so that's the way you could write it out in words. In symbols, x cannot be -5. In symbols, it's that double line r. So that's all real numbers except x cannot be -3 and x cannot be -5. All right, so a little bit less writing if you just remember this symbol here is the same as the all real numbers part. All right, so that's the domain of this rational. All right, this one, find the domain of x over x. All right, so this one looks pretty simple. What a lot of people would do is x over x, you can simplify that to 1 over 1, which is just 1. And if you always get 1, you can plug in anything. All right, but the problem with this is you can't simplify your fraction first before you find the domain, because if I were to plug in 0 into this function, I get 0 over 0. And again, it doesn't matter if there's a 0 on the top. Whenever I have a 0 on the bottom, that's a bad thing. All right, so I don't want to ever get 0 on the bottom of a fraction. All right, so don't simplify your fraction at all. All right, just take whatever is on the bottom of your fraction and set it equal to 0. And that's your bad values. All right, so this one, our domain is going to be all real numbers except x cannot be 0. And in symbols, the double r, x can't be 0. All right, so you don't have to write both of these. Pick one or the other. All right, but I would always write it in the bottom way because it's less writing. All right, but if you're not going to remember this symbol, you can always write it out in words. All right, so that is the domain. Again, don't simplify at all. For all these questions, if you're finding the domain of a rational, just take the bottom of your fraction and set it equal to 0. All right, so here's one for you to try on your own. I find the domain of this rational. And again, this is what you should get. The first step, always the same, just take whatever the bottom of your fraction is and set it equal to 0. You solve this one similar to the other quadratic. So again, that x squared means you have to solve it like a quadratic. All right, this one you factor two numbers that add to 3, multiply to 2. And you get -2 and -1 are your bad values. So your domain is going to be all the real numbers except those two bad values. And again, writing it in the kind of math notation, all real numbers except those two bad values. All right, so that's the domain of our rational. We have to know what we cannot plug in to our rational, but everything else we can plug in. All right, so for this learning objective, you're going to have to do a skill check. All right, there's going to be 3 different problems, and one of them is going to have a quadratic on the bottom, like that example that we just did. All right, to make sure you're not forgetting how to do things that we did in the fall as well. All right, so just remember this whole skill check. If you have some fraction, you take whatever's on the bottom and you set it equal to 0. That'll give you your bad values. And then make sure you actually answer the question and do that last step of the domain is equal to all real numbers except those bad values. So make sure you answer the whole question. But knowing that first step of your setting the bottom equal to 0 is the most important part.